Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube. Happy New Year, everyone. In this video, I'm going to be talking about what makes a mix sound big. Now, just a quick little preface, this video is going to be mostly me talking and discussing the ideas. There's going to be a little bit of demonstration, but it's mostly going to be me throwing out some theoretical concepts. I think that it's going to be important to listen to because we want our records usually to sound big. So, bigness is a collection of a lot of ideas. It overlaps heavily with the idea of loudness, but they are not the same. In fact, sometimes one idea can work against the other, and we're going to talk about that. But the first thing I want to discuss is the tallness of a record. So the tallness of a record refers to the extremes of the top and the bottom. Our records tend to sound big when we have very low lows and very high highs. This creates the widest amount of contrast and the biggest amount of space within the record's frequency spectrum. Now, right now, you're looking at my image without any kind of bigness added to it. Yeah, I'm talking about my visual image right now. Right now, this is just the way that it was recorded in RAW with no processing. It's all focused into what we would call the mid-range of the light spectrum. If I start adding contrast, you'll notice that the image starts to get bigger. So I'm going to do that right now. And now that I've done that, you see that this contrast creates an image that has a lot more depth and size to it. Well, audio is the same way. When we increase the amount of low lows and high highs, we end up getting more contrast across the frequency spectrum. We create a bigger sound. So that is one contribution. The next contribution is going to be the vividness of the record. This pertains to saturation. Right now, there is no saturation on my image. Yep, I'm comparing to the image again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now add saturation so that my whole image becomes more vivid. And now that I've done that, all of a sudden my picture becomes a lot larger because everything can be more identified. Now, audio saturation is very similar. Audio saturation is the production of harmonics that make a sound be that sound. If you saturate a kick drum, you make it more kick drummy. If you saturate a bass, you make it more bassy, and you also create more energy in that element that allows the ear to identify it. So even though technically you are adding distortion, in a weird way, you're actually clarifying the image. Now, the difference between audio saturation and video film saturation is that audio saturation can be done a number of different ways. There are different saturation profiles that can be created in the audio spectrum based on the distribution of harmonics. In film, it's not so much. Saturation is a little bit more of a straight ahead process. It's just one thing. It's making the color more the color. And then lastly, the big thing that creates the idea of bigness is going to be the depth of the record. So when we create a sense of space, we create the illusion of bigness. So for example, here in my video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus myself a little bit more, and I'm going to blur the background a little bit more. And now that I've done that, that creates a front to back contrast. That creates a bigger image as well. Well, audio is the same way. If we have something that is forward and something that is far away sounding, it creates a sense of bigness in terms of the overall space. And this is also true in our left to right imaging. So if we have wider left to right imaging and deeper front to back imaging, we create an overall bigger sound. Now, let's talk about loudness and how it relates to these ideas. So, when a sound gets louder, as in we just turn it up, our brain goes, that sound is bigger, right? There's a certain level where loud equals big. But we need to dissect that a little bit because loudness is perceived amplitude. It's not amplitude, it's not level, it's the way we perceive level. And there's a few things that are really, really crucial to understand about how we perceive level. The first is in our dynamic curves. So if we have a sound that is very, very loud, but only for a few milliseconds, and then resolves to being something much quieter, we hear that sound as being less loud than a sound that is, say, maybe really, really loud for 20 milliseconds and then resolves to being much quieter. We determine loudness by the average level over short periods. So we can make something louder by actually restricting the dynamic range, which is a little counterintuitive to a certain extent. However, if we continue to restrict the dynamic range, the transient, the quick sounds that we don't necessarily identify as loudness, but we identify as punch, they start to shrink. So in a weird way, there's kind of this dynamic curve where as we start to compress a sound, the sound gets bigger and then starts getting smaller. Right? So it kind of has like a curve to it. It's bigger, 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 around the same very briefly, and then smaller, 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 smaller. And the reason that is because let's say we take two sounds that are perceived to be the same level. We level match. This is very common in, say, a mastered record versus a mix print. The mix print will typically have more transient energy because nothing has been done to make the record playback louder. So, normally when we make the record playback louder, we use a limiter. The limiter is going to chop down those transients and push the average level up. But if we level match them, when we hear them at the same level, the bigness of the version that has transients, it's bigger. So we have to kind of negotiate that. We have definitely gone past the point of like no return in the loudness wars, where we are making things louder to the point that they are actually shrinking in terms of their bigness. So that's one consideration. The other part of loudness is what's called the Fletcher-Munson curve, which is how we hear in a nonlinear fashion. The basic gist of it is that our ears really tune into the upper mid-range, that 1 to 4K range in particular. We're very, very sensitive to that range. So when we have two sounds, one that's, say, in the sub-range, like, 60 hertz, 80 hertz, something like that, and we have another sound that's, say, 1.5K, if they are played back at the same level, the one that is 1.5K will actually sound louder. The question is, will it sound bigger? And the answer to that is no. Bigness really comes from the lows and the extension of the top. So in a way, pushing something louder by forcing upper mid-range in also kind of makes the record smaller. So we have to negotiate those ideas. Now, I want to demonstrate some of this stuff briefly, but I think that it's important just to take note that when we are mixing for bigness, it's not quite the same as mixing for loudness, and what we're mainly listening for is the contrast between the top and the bottom, the resolution and identifiability of everything that is in the mix, which involves saturation, also involves making sure that things kind of have their own space, but mostly, sometimes when things are kind of blurred over each other, they can still sound big. But I think saturation is a big part of that, and that we have a good side-to-side and front-to-back imaging. So let's jump in here. I'm going to play this record. I did a quick mix to this. I wouldn't say it's like a perfect mix, but, it's pretty good for like an hour and a half, and we've got this.
No M-I-N-D, and that's fine by me, cause I'm all about the money, but I never been a dummy. Go hard on the honey, I just wanna put my cup in her tummy. Now she getting lovey-dovey, all kissy on huggy, that's cool. She giving my part-time cuddy body, got a hook like a druggy. All she wanna do is study on my like a fiend. Take one for the cools, take one for the team. Like a dream, till it's clean, do you know what I mean? Get in the F430, glint and her eyes looking at me all dirty.
So I was able to get this record to sound pretty big, although I will qualify that with something in a moment. The vocal is, well, I guess I'm qualifying it now. The vocal is a little strident. I kind of like the feel of it that way, even though it's not technically like ideal, and that does shrink the record a little bit, right? It goes exactly into that idea of pulling that 1.5, 2K kind of energy forward, makes things louder, it makes things more aggressive, it doesn't necessarily make things bigger. In fact, it can actually have the opposite effect. I do feel like that's going on here to a certain extent, but I also just kind of like the clarity and the punch and the aggressiveness of it, so I ended up keeping it. But let's take a look at some of the things that are making this record sound big. And by the way, if I put a limiter on this at the end, the playback will sound enormous. I've tested it, but I also don't want to blow your speakers out. So, first of all, let's take a look at the contrast, right? The big thing here is this 808 and this hat flange. the two extremes of the spectrum. By making sure that these, as well as the ARP and Love Synth, are nice and present, we're giving a lot of contrast to the frequency spectrum. We have a very, very deep low. We have a very, very high high. Now that's natural to the arrangement. So this even factors in before we start looking at the mix. If we don't have these kinds of elements in, something that has an extreme top, something that has an extreme bottom, we might need to build those in ourselves. We might need to trigger a sine wave off of a kick, or use some kind of a harmonic generator off of a bass, or just EQ the snot out of our bass and crank 30 hertz all the way up. Why not? There's no laws against it. Now, the issue here with just leaving it as is, yes, my voice just cracked, it's fine. The issue with leaving it here is that it's hard to identify the 808 on small speakers.
By me, cause I'm all about the money, but I never been a dummy. Go hard on the honey. I just wanna put my cup in her tummy. Now she getting lovey-dovey, you kissy on her.
This has two effects. First, it makes the vocal feel disproportionate to the record. We get a little bit of that karaoke effect, which does make the record sound smaller in and of itself, because now it's getting more of its attention to the mid-range, right? In addition to that, it makes the record feel smaller because we can't identify the bigness of it on smaller speakers. So we need to do something that calls attention to it and makes it vivid. And here we're going to use Decapitator in order to get some overtones into that 808, make it less clean, make it more distinct. So this is RB4. So a lot of nose tone shows up, a lot of that 100, 200 hertz stuff starts showing up, those overtones that are going to replay on smaller speakers. Now, in and of itself, this feels like a very distinct change. It is not distracting when it's in the mix.
By me, cause I'm all about the money, but I never been a dummy. Go hard on the honey. I just wanna put my cup in her tummy. Now she getting lovey-dovey, you kissy on huggy. That's cool. She giving my part-time cuddy buddy.
So now we have that presence in the 808, it calls attention to that low end, and we create a deeper contrast between the lows and the highs, and we don't have the record feeling quite as mid-range focused. So next, let's talk about the front-to-back imaging. Obviously, our vocal is very, very forward. We need something to contrast that in the background in order to make it feel like there's a good sense of three-dimensional space. So here we have a really, really nice element, this reverb clap thing right here, and I'll play it. So it's kind of like a midfield sound with a really washy digital plate thing happening in the background. I'm going to do a little processing. I'm going to stretch it out side to side here, and I'm really going to go pretty heavy-handed on the widener. And I'm actually going to pull some top end out. So in and of itself, this might make the sound actually a little smaller. Right? You can hear it sort of falls into the background as I pull that high end out, and as the accentuation of the reverb on the sides comes up, right? So I'm pushing it into the background, but let's listen to it in the context of the record.
Cool, she giving my part-time cuddy buddy. Got a hook like a druggie. All she wanna do is study on my like a fiend. Take one for the cool, take one for the team. Like a dream, till it's clean. Do you know what I mean?
Now after.
Cool, she giving my part-time cuddy buddy. Got a hook like a druggie. All she wanna do is study on my like a fiend. Take one for the cool, take one for the team. Like a dream, till it's clean. Do you know what I mean? In the F430, glint and I rise.
So in a very weird and counterintuitive way, even though I've made the sound smaller by darkening it and pushing it into the background further, I've actually made the record bigger by creating a deeper contrast in the front to back between the vocal and this particular element. Now, again, this was provided in a way by the producer. If you don't have something that's allowing for the far image to exist, we want to probably create it. Not always. Sometimes there's a sort of essence to something where everything is super far forward. Those aren't the biggest sounding records. They have a different feel to them. They're the more in-your-face kind of raw sounding records, which is an attitude that can be totally great for the music you're working on, but it's not going to be a bigger sound. this is the bigger sound. So if we don't have an element that's already in there that's doing this, it's pretty easy. You just find an element that isn't primary. You know, something like this one-time clap, if it didn't have that reverb on it, I could just put that reverb on there. You know, same thing with like this tablet right here. Right? If I don't have this reverb clap and I don't want to use a clap for whatever reason, I could just take a reverb, let's say like Deverb, stock Pro Tools, and I could put it at like 50% wet.
That's cool, she give him a part-time body.
Let's use a slightly shorter decay. Let's turn the level up to compensate a little bit.
That's cool, she give him a part-time body. Got a hook like a druggie, all she wanna do is study on my like a fiend, take one for the cool, take.
I mean, that's pretty sloppy, but you get the idea that I can create something that has that front to back contrast. And then lastly, on the mix bus, I want to talk about the treatment. So this is the Corniff Audio Puff Mix Pass, which I've been playing with a lot. I really like it quite a bit. This is a saturator, but it's a subtle saturator. So I'm going to take this off for a second.
That's cool, she give him a part-time body. Got a hook like a druggie, all she wanna do is study on my like a fiend, take one for the cool, take one for the team. Like a dream, till it's clean, do you know what I mean? Get in the F430, glint and I rise looking up.
It brings everything forward. So this is another example of saturation as well as some dynamic manipulation. So what I'm doing with this is I'm saturating the entire mix slightly. It colors it up, it brings the whole thing forward, and I'm also compressing the dynamics ever so slightly, although not as much as it does by default. And this is ultimately raising the average level, but doing it slightly. So remember I mentioned that curve of like, as you start to compress things, it gets bigger, then it starts getting smaller. I'm trying to get up that hill on the bigger side of things. I maybe a little bit more would get a little bigger, but I found a sweet spot where the color sat nicely, which is sort of also a point, which is, you know, sometimes bigger isn't always better. You know, if it's a trade-off here between being like overly colored, overly saturated versus being like not quite as big, I might prefer it to be not quite as big. So putting the saturation here to, you know, we do this in a lot of different ways. A lot of times people will use clippers, soft clippers at the end in order to do this. But that is a look at how we can use sort of basic mix techniques to work toward the idea of bigness. I hope that you dig this video. If you like this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe. If you know anybody that you think would benefit from watching this video, hit share. Let's wrap it up here. This is, what the heck do I say on the way out? Oh my gosh. You know what we say here at Weiss Advice. Do I? Have I forgotten what we say here at Weiss Advice? We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.